Hi everyone and welcome. It's Steve Johnson here, Chief Investment Officer at Forager Funds, and this is our last Friday video for 2020. I'm joined by Portfolio Manager on the International Fund, Gareth Brown. How are you going, Gareth?
Hi Steve. Hi everyone.
Gareth, you've just published your eagerly anticipated Books of the Year blog for 2020. A lot of interesting reading on there. What's one book that you haven't read on the list that you want to get onto next?
There's probably a guilty pleasure in there. I'm very, very cautious around the self-help section of the bookstore because there's a hell of a lot of them and most of them are crap. That essentialism book that Jeff Whedon recommended sounded appealing to me for one reason or another. And the other one that stood out was These Truths, which is the history book on the United States that you've put up. I read an excellent book on the history of California once by Kevin Starr, I forgot his name again, that I really like that genre, but broad history books can go either way, I guess.
Yeah, look, it's a long one, and I'll put that in there, so you need some time, but it doesn't need to all be read at once. I honestly found every 10 pages of it was something fascinating that I didn't know, and it's an incredibly well-researched book. So it's actually a relatively easy read, I would say, for a book that's big, book that is that big. Your own recommendation was The Reed Warbler, Call of the Reed Warbler, a book about agriculture in Australia. Are you finding yourself reading less directly investment related books as you get older?
Yeah, that's true. And I think, I devoured nearly purely investment books there for a 10 or 15 year period. And now they're at best a little adjunct on the side and mostly biographical rather than, 101s or how-tos. My interests are a lot wider than that and have been for a long time.
And I think I find I often pull things out of books that are not directly investing related that are applicable in your investing life. And I think as you get older and more experienced, sometimes it's those unique insights that are the biggest drivers of value in terms of your portfolio. One of my books on the list was The Biggest Bluff by Maria Konnikova, and it's a book about poker, which probably does have some direct applications to investing, but she talked about a game in that book that I really took a lot out of. Apparently a lot of professional poker players play this game called Loddon Thinks, and it's a guessing game. They give the example of guessing Clint Eastwood's age in it, but I'm not trying to guess what his age actually is. I'm trying to guess what someone else thinks his age is. So we play the game with a third party and we say, well, what does Alex Shevelev, or how old does he think Clint Eastwood is? And you want your own view about how old he is, and then you want to think, well, what does Alex know about that? And I think there's a lot of applications for that in our lives as well, and particularly investing when you're trying to forecast a company's future. I've been thinking a lot about uranium lately, and I think a lot of people have some perhaps compelling logical arguments about why uranium should be a good fuel source. It doesn't really matter if the majority of the population is not going to back it. It's more important what the majority thinks than what the logic actually is in that regard.
I can't remember where I read it, but just recently I read how that in the markets you get paid well for being 10 minutes ahead of the crowd, not being 10 years ahead of the crowd.
So do you think it's important to keep reading pure investment books as part of the mix for you?
I would say no. I think once you've done that work and you have your own style, it's really important to practice rather than to go back into the theory all the time. As I said, I'm most interested in the biographical stuff, and there are people there that just really intrigue me, and they're not necessarily investors the same way I am. Like Jim Simon's being one that I read his biography recently. Ed Thorpe, for example. I think it's really important to read about different styles, and maybe you can take a small nugget of what they do and incorporate it into who you are. And the other thing is to understand your competition. These are guys that are on the other side of the trades that we're making sometimes, and you really need to know your enemy, right? It's a competitive system.
Yeah, and I find I still really enjoy the genre as well. Biography, also just some of the sagas around the world, like Billion Dollar Whale about the collapse of 1MDB. I think if you're not interested in those sorts of things, just as stories, you probably don't want to be in this industry as a job, right? I still find it entertaining, and I find usually interesting insights into human nature. Look, one question we do get a lot, aspiring young investors coming along and saying, well, what would you recommend I read as I'm getting started in the early years? What are your top 3 books for an aspiring investor?
I think you need a good founding in a good grounding, I should say, in value investing. So, the entry point for me was some of the biographies of Buffett which I read in the early and mid 90s that sort of just clicked with me, which probably had a more profound effect than a more practical book. So I'm not going to tell you what's going to inoculate for someone new to the game today, but that's what worked for me. I think The Intelligent Investor, at a minimum, there learned some of the practicalities of the Ben Graham approach, but a lot of that is really, really hard to practice today. It's just completely shut down that highly, very much value-derived space. But I would say probably the most profound book for me was Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits. It was, we've done that Ben Graham approach. We have stocks in our portfolio now to this day, Oriental Watch that Paul brought to us, trading below net working capital. I love to own those, but it's really hard to fill a portfolio with them if you're managing more than about $1 million. Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits was just bringing me to that quality end of the spectrum and understanding what you have to do and how well you have to know these businesses and all the points you need to take into account. The book's 50 years old.
Yeah. I think one really interesting thing about that book is it lets you start with what you're interested in and what you know and say, well, how can I apply that to the stock market to make money, rather than trying to go and compete against people that have been doing it for 20 years in certain areas. And something I've been working with Chloe a lot with over the past 3 years is, okay, let's start with the things that you're really interested in and where you think you might have an edge, and then what are the types of stocks that I might be able to apply that knowledge to, rather than trying to analyze everything and compete with everyone on that.
And I think the absolute key part of that book, or the key lesson for me, was that they're finding companies that have the ability to reinvest a lot at really high rates of return. It's almost difficult to pay too much for those kind of things and do well, if you get the right one, of course. Yeah. And then again, a lot of that's now been shut down as well. So we need to evolve over time. The other book that sort of stands out was You Can Be a Stock Market Genius by Joel Greenblatt. Horrible name. Everyone has to reference the horrible name. It was a horrible name. What I liked about that was it took that sort of Ben Graham, like finding statistical bargains, but here's where you might want to go and look. Like, here's the ponds where you might want to go fishing, spin-offs, IPOs, areas where there's significant capacity for mispricings. Not necessarily cheap, but sometimes cheap. Just areas where you might not get it wrong. The market might get it wrong, and hopefully those sort of opportunities keep popping up.
Yeah, become a really big part of our process, I think, starting with why something might be cheap rather than ending with that question. Okay, that's our books video for the year. Thanks for tuning in. Have a fantastic Christmas yourself, and we'll be back in the new year with more.